when 17-year-old Marcus Caldwell decided to mess with the new substitute teacher at Riverside High. He thought he was just pulling another harmless prank. What he didn't know was that Ms. Victoria Hayes had spent the last 8 years teaching English in Bangkok, where she'd also been training at one of Thailand's most brutal Muay Thai camps. By the end of that Tuesday afternoon, Marcus would learn the hard way that some teachers fight back. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria Hayes adjusted her rearview mirror one last time before stepping out of her silver Honda Civic into the parking lot of Riverside High School. The October morning air carried the smell of fallen leaves and teenage rebellion. At 29, she looked younger than most of the senior teachers, with shoulder-length auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wire-rimmed glasses that made her appear bookish rather than intimidating. She'd spent the weekend preparing for this moment, reviewing lesson plans and trying to shake off 8 years of teaching in international schools across Southeast Asia. After her divorce finalized last spring, Victoria had returned to her hometown of Cedar Falls, Iowa, hoping for a fresh start. The substitute teaching position at Riverside was supposed to be temporary, just long enough to get her bearings before finding something permanent. The hallways buzzed with the familiar chaos of a Tuesday morning. Students clustered around lockers, their conversations a mix of weekend gossip and complaints about upcoming tests. Victoria made her way to the main office, her sensible flats clicking against the polished linoleum floors. "You must be Ms. Hayes," said Margaret Chun, the school secretary, looking up from her computer with a warm smile. "Welcome to Riverside. How are you feeling about jumping into Mrs. Patterson's classes?" "A little nervous, honestly," Victoria admitted, accepting a thick folder of lesson plans. "It's been a while since I've taught American high school students." Margaret's expression grew slightly sympathetic. "Well, I should probably warn you, Mrs. Patterson's 5th period can be challenging, especially with Marcus Caldwell and his crew. They've been giving substitutes a particularly hard time this semester." Victoria nodded, filing away the information. She'd dealt with difficult students before. In Bangkok, she'd taught classes of 35 teenagers in sweltering heat with minimal resources. How different could Iowa high schoolers be? The morning classes went smoothly enough. Her sophomore English students were mostly attentive, and even the juniors in 4th period showed reasonable respect. Victoria began to relax, thinking Margaret's warning might have been overly cautious. Then the 5th period arrived. Marcus Caldwell strutted into the classroom like he owned it, his designer sneakers squeaking against the floor. At 6 feet tall, with the build of someone who spent serious time in the weight room, he commanded attention from his classmates. His blonde hair was styled with expensive products, and his Letterman jacket bore patches from 3 different sports. Behind him trailed his usual entourage, Jake Morrison, a wiry kid with nervous eyes who laughed too loud at Marcus's jokes, and Tyler Brooks, whose family money had bought him a reputation for getting away with anything. Victoria watched them settle into their seats with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read student dynamics quickly. Marcus chose a desk in the back corner, positioning himself where he could see the entire room while maintaining maximum distance from the teacher's desk. His followers flanked him like bodyguards. "Good afternoon, everyone." Victoria began moving to stand in front of her desk. "I'm Ms. Hayes, and I'll be covering for Mrs. Patterson while she's recovering from her surgery. I know change can be disruptive, but I'm hoping we can make this transition as smooth as possible." A few students nodded politely. Marcus examined his fingernails with exaggerated boredom. "Today we're continuing your work on character analysis. In The Great Gatsby," Victoria continued, reaching for the stack of books on her desk. "I'd like everyone to turn to Chapter 7, and, hey, Ms. Hayes," Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying that particular tone of manufactured innocence that teachers learn to recognize. "Are you, actually qualified to teach this?" Because Mrs. Patterson has been doing this for 20 years. A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the classroom. Victoria paused, keeping her expression neutral. She'd heard this challenge before, in different languages in different countries. I have my master's degree in English literature and 8 years of teaching experience, she replied calmly. I think that qualifies me to help you understand Fitzgerald's symbolism. Marcus leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. 8 years where? Some community college? International schools in Thailand, actually, Victoria said, opening her copy of the novel. Now if we could focus on the text. Thailand? Tyler piped up, snickering. What were you doing there? Teaching English to elephants. More laughter. Louder this time. Victoria noticed that even some of the normally well-behaved students were grinning. This was the moment she'd learned to recognize, the tipping point where a classroom could either fall into chaos or be brought back under control. I was teaching students who spoke 3 languages fluently, Victoria said, her voice remaining steady but carrying a slight edge, which is more than I can say for some people who struggle with just one. The laughter died abruptly. Marcus's eyes narrowed, recognizing the subtle insult. He wasn't used to teachers who fought back with words. You know what? Marcus said, standing up with theatrical slowness. I need to use the bathroom. Without waiting for permission, he sauntered toward the door. Victoria watched him go, noting how Jake and Tyler exchanged meaningful glances. She'd seen this pattern before too, the setup for something bigger. 20 minutes later, Marcus returned, sliding back into his seat with a smirk that told Victoria everything she needed to know. He'd used his bathroom break for more than just biological needs. The rest of the period passed in tense civility. Victoria managed to lead a discussion about symbolism and Gatsby, though Marcus and his friends made periodic attempts to derail the conversation with irrelevant questions and staged confusion. By the time the bell rang, Victoria felt like she'd just gone 3 rounds in a boxing ring. As students filed out, she heard Marcus's voice carry from the hallway. Tomorrow's gonna be epic. Victoria gathered her materials, wondering what exactly she'd walked into. In Thailand, problem students usually acted out through direct confrontation or simply stopped attending class. American teenagers, she was learning, preferred psychological warfare. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident. 6th period was a study hall that required minimal interaction, and 7th period's freshman composition. Class was populated by students, still young enough to be intimidated by authority figures. As Victoria packed up her desk at the end of the day, she reflected on her first day at Riverside. It hadn't been the smooth reintegration into American education she'd hoped for, but it hadn't been a disaster either. She'd handled worse situations before. Walking to her car, Victoria passed the football field where practice was already underway. She could see Marcus among the players, his earlier classroom bravado translated into aggressive tackles and loud celebrations. He was clearly someone used to being the center of attention, someone who didn't like having his authority challenged. Victoria had met plenty of Marcus Caldwells in her career. The wealthy, athletic, popular students who treated school like their personal kingdom and teachers like inconvenient obstacles. What they didn't usually expect was resistance. As she drove home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, Victoria found herself thinking about the Muay Thai gym in Bangkok, where she'd spent most evenings after school. The brutal training sessions that had taught her discipline, focus, and the kind of confidence that didn't need to announce itself. Her coach, Krusum Chai, had always said that the strongest fighters were the ones who looked least dangerous. Victoria smiled slightly, remembering his words. Tomorrow would bring whatever Marcus had planned, but she'd faced down teenagers before. And if necessary, she had skills that went far beyond classroom management. She just hoped she wouldn't need to use them. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Victoria Hayes appreciate being back in the Midwest. She'd slept well for the first time since returning from Thailand, her small apartment finally starting to feel like home rather than just another temporary stop. Over coffee and toast, she reviewed her lesson plans for the day. Fifth period would be discussing Chapter 8 of Gatsby, the confrontation scene between Tom and Gatsby at the Plaza Hotel. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd be teaching about confrontation while likely facing one herself. At Riverside High, Marcus Caldwell had arrived early for once, bypassing his usual morning routine of intimidating freshmen near the parking lot. Instead, he'd gone straight to his locker, where Jake Morrison was already waiting with nervous energy. "Are you sure about this?" Jake asked, glancing around the hallway. "Mrs. Chun has been watching us like hawks since the fire alarm thing last month." Marcus pulled a small tube from his backpack, holding it up like a trophy. "Industrial strength adhesive," he said with satisfaction. "My dad uses this stuff for construction. Once it sets, nothing's getting unstuck without some serious force." "Tyler." Brooks jogged up to them, slightly out of breath. "Did you get it?" "Obviously," Marcus replied, tucking the tube into his jacket pocket. "Hayes thinks she's so smart with her fancy Thailand stories and her attitude. Let's see how smart she feels when she's literally stuck to her chair in front of the whole class." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The plan was simple, as the best pranks usually were. During lunch, Marcus would slip into the empty classroom and apply the adhesive to Victoria's chair. The clear, fast-setting glue would be invisible until she sat down, and by then, it would be too late. The image of the new teacher trapped in her chair, unable to stand up while 30 teenagers laughed at her, filled Marcus with anticipation. What if she doesn't sit down? Jake worried. "Some teachers just stand the whole time." "She sit," Tyler said confidently. "She did yesterday when she was reading that quote from the book. Besides, teachers always sit when they're trying to be all serious and authoritative." Marcus nodded, already imagining the viral potential. Someone would definitely film it, and by evening the video would be all over social media. The stuck teacher would become a legend, and Marcus would cement his reputation as the guy who could make even the tough substitutes look ridiculous. The morning passed slowly for all involved parties. Victoria taught her earlier classes with growing unease, noticing how certain students kept glancing at her with barely suppressed amusement. Word traveled fast in high schools, and she could sense that something was brewing. During lunch, while Victoria ate her sandwich in the faculty lounge and tried to make small talk with the permanent teachers, Marcus executed his plan. The hallways were mostly empty, with students either in the cafeteria or outside enjoying the unseasonably warm weather. Room 247 was unlocked, as it always was during lunch period. Marcus slipped inside, closing the door behind him but leaving it slightly ajar so he could hear approaching footsteps. The classroom smelled like whiteboard markers and teenage anxiety, familiar scents that reminded him why he preferred being anywhere else. Victoria's chair sat behind the wooden desk, its black fabric seat looking innocent enough. Marcus approached it like a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. He'd practiced the application technique on his own desk chair at home, timing himself until he could complete the task in under 30 seconds. The adhesive came out clear and thick, spreading evenly across the seat cushion. Marcus worked quickly but carefully, ensuring complete coverage without making it obvious. The stuff was designed to bond with fabric instantly while remaining tacky enough to grab onto clothing or skin. As he capped the tube, Marcus heard voices in the hallway. He pocketed the evidence and moved to the window, pretending to look outside. With casual interest, Mrs. Rodriguez from next door poked her head in. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" "Oh, hey, Mrs. Rodriguez," Marcus replied with his most innocent smile. "I left my calculator yesterday, and Ms. Hayes said I could grab it before lunch ended." Mrs. Rodriguez frowned slightly, but didn't question him further. Marcus retrieved a calculator from his backpack, one he'd brought specifically for this excuse, and headed for the door. "Found it," he said cheerfully, holding up the device as he passed her. 15 minutes later, the lunch bell rang and students began filtering back into the building. Marcus made sure to arrive at fifth period right on time, neither early enough to seem suspicious nor late enough to miss the show. Victoria entered the classroom precisely as the tardy bell finished ringing, her arms full of graded papers and her lesson plan folder. She looked composed and professional, wearing a navy blazer over dark slacks that made her appear more formal than she had the day before. "Good afternoon, everyone," she said, moving toward her desk. "I have your character analysis essays from last week. Overall, I was impressed with the depth of thinking, though we need to work on supporting arguments with textual evidence." She set the papers down and reached for her copy of The Great Gatsby. Several students leaned forward in their seats, and Marcus noticed phones being discreetly positioned for optimal filming angles. "Before we dive into Chapter 8, Victoria continued, I want to discuss something about yesterday's class. There seemed to be some confusion about my qualifications and background." Marcus smirked, thinking she was going to launch into some defensive speech about her credentials. Instead, Victoria surprised him. "I spent 8 years teaching at international schools because I wanted to understand different perspectives on American literature. When you read Gatsby in Thailand or Vietnam, you see themes of wealth and status differently. When you teach students who learned English as a second language, you appreciate the beauty of Fitzgerald's prose in ways you might not otherwise." She paused, looking directly at Marcus. "Education isn't about proving you're smarter than everyone else. It's about opening your mind to experiences beyond your immediate world." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. The lecture was clearly aimed at him, delivered with the kind of calm authority that made him feel like a scolded child. His friends were watching his reaction, waiting to see how he'd respond to being called out. "That's great and all," Marcus said, slouching back in his chair, "but maybe you should focus on teaching instead of giving us life lessons." Victoria nodded slowly, as if considering his point. "You're absolutely right, Marcus. Let's focus on the text." She moved toward her chair, and Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This was it, the moment he'd been planning. His phone was already recording, hidden behind his textbook. Victoria pulled out her chair and began to sit down, just as Marcus had predicted. The classroom fell silent with anticipation. 30 pairs of eyes focused on their teacher. But something unexpected happened. Just as Victoria's weight began to settle onto the chair, she paused mid-sit, as if something felt wrong. Her hand gripped the armrest, and she seemed to test the surface with just the edge of her leg. Marcus held his breath. Has she noticed something? The adhesive should have been completely invisible. Victoria completed her sitting motion, and for a moment, Marcus thought his plan had failed entirely. She appeared to be sitting normally, reaching for her book with no sign of distress. Then she tried to stand up. The moment Victoria attempted to rise from the chair, the industrial adhesive revealed its purpose. Her blazer and slacks were firmly bonded to the fabric seat, creating an embarrassing and uncomfortable trap exactly as Marcus had intended. Victoria's eyes widened as she realized what had happened. She tugged against the chair, feeling the strong pull of the adhesive against her clothing. The classroom erupted in barely contained snickers and whispered comments. "Oh my God," someone whispered. "Is she stuck?" Another student asked. Marcus couldn't suppress his grin as he watched Victoria's predicament unfold. His phone captured every second of her growing realization that she'd been pranked, and pranked effectively. But what happened next would change everything Marcus thought he knew about his new substitute teacher. Instead of panicking or calling for help, Victoria's expression shifted into something Marcus had never seen before. Her initial surprise melted away. replaced by a cold, calculating look that made several students stop laughing abruptly. Victoria placed both hands on the armrests of the chair and took a slow, deep breath. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and when she looked up at the class, her eyes had changed completely. "Well," she said quietly, her voice carrying a dangerous undertone that made Marcus's stomach drop, "this is interesting." The laughter died completely. Something in Victoria's tone suggested that whoever was responsible for this prank had just made a very serious mistake. Victoria Hayes sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only 10 seconds. The classroom had fallen into the kind of silence that makes every small sound, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant rumble of hallway traffic, someone's nervous breathing seem amplified. Marcus watched her face carefully, waiting for the embarrassment and frustration he'd expected. Instead, he saw something that made his confident smirk begin to fade. Victoria wasn't looking around helplessly or calling for assistance. She was thinking, and whatever thoughts were running through her mind didn't seem pleasant. "You know," Victoria said conversationally, still not attempting to stand, "in Thailand, there's a concept called kreng jai. It roughly translates to consideration for others, avoiding actions that might cause embarrassment or discomfort." She looked directly at Marcus as she spoke, her voice maintaining that unsettling calm. "It's considered one of the most important social values. The idea that your behavior reflects not just on you, but on your family, your community, your teachers." Jake Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This wasn't going the way any of them had imagined. Teachers were supposed to get flustered, call the principal, maybe even cry. They weren't supposed to give cultural lectures while trapped in furniture. "Of course," Victoria continued, "Thailand also has Muay Thai, the art of 8 limbs. And in Muay Thai, there's a different principle entirely." She placed her hands flat on the desk in front of her, and Marcus noticed for the first time that her knuckles showed small, faded scars. Her forearms, partially visible beneath her blazer sleeves, were more muscular than he'd initially observed. "When someone shows you disrespect," Victoria said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "you respond with decisive action." As Victoria rose, her movement was different from anything Marcus had seen from a teacher before. There was a fluidity to it, a sense of controlled power that belonged more in a martial arts studio than a high school classroom. When she turned to face the class fully, her stance had shifted into something that looked deceptively relaxed but somehow threatening. 8 years in Bangkok," Victoria said, rolling her shoulders slightly. 6 nights a week at Lumpini Stadium's training camp, sparring with fighters who were preparing for championship bouts. She walked slowly toward the center of the classroom, and students instinctively leaned back in their chairs. Her gait was different now, balanced, predatory, like a fighter circling an opponent. "I started training because the neighborhood where I lived wasn't particularly safe for foreign women. By the time I left, I'd won 3 amateur tournaments and was working as a sparring partner for professional fighters." Marcus felt his mouth go dry. This couldn't be real. Teachers didn't talk like this. They didn't move like this. And they definitely didn't look like they were considering which bones to break first. Victoria stopped in front of Marcus's desk, close enough that he could see the calluses on her knuckles and the way her muscles tensed beneath her professional attire. Her eyes, which had seemed so mild behind those wire-rimmed glasses, now held something that made Marcus want to disappear. "Industrial adhesive," she observed, examining the sticky residue on her fingers. "Strong enough to bond permanently with most fabrics. Someone put real thought into this." The classroom was dead silent. Even the students who hadn't been involved in the prank looked terrified. This was no longer about a simple joke gone wrong. Something much more serious was happening. "In Muay Thai," Victoria continued, "we have a saying, the fighter who strikes first often wins, but the fighter who strikes last always wins. Do you know what that means, Marcus?" Marcus tried to speak but found his voice had abandoned him. He shook his head slightly, suddenly aware that his 6-foot frame and weight room muscles felt insignificant compared to the energy radiating from the small woman standing over him. "It means patience is a weapon," Victoria explained. "It means waiting for your opponent to reveal their intentions before you reveal yours. It means letting someone think they have the advantage right up until the moment you show them how wrong they are." She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her phone, holding it up so Marcus could see the screen. It showed the classroom from an angle he hadn't expected. Apparently she'd been recording the entire time. "You see, Marcus, I've been teaching for 8 years. I've seen every prank, every attempt to embarrass or undermine authority. The glue on the chair, that's amateur hour. I spotted it the moment I walked in." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. You knew?" "The smell," Victoria explained matter-of-factly. "Industrial adhesives have a distinctive chemical odor. Plus, you've been fidgeting with nervous energy since I entered the room, and your friends have been positioning their phones for optimal filming angles." She gestured toward Jake and Tyler, who were now trying to hide their devices. "The question isn't whether I knew about your little prank. The question is what I'm going to do about it." Victoria walked back toward her desk, her movements still carrying that predatory grace. She picked up the chair, examining the adhesive residue with professional interest. "This is actually quite clever," she admitted. "Strong enough to be genuinely embarrassing, but not dangerous. You could have chosen something that would cause injury, but you didn't. That shows restraint." Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she was going to let this slide. Maybe the lecture was enough. "Unfortunately," Victoria continued, "restraint in planning doesn't excuse disrespect in execution." She set the chair down and turned back to face the class. When she removed her wire-rimmed glasses and set them carefully on her desk, the transformation was complete. The mild-mannered substitute teacher had vanished entirely, replaced by someone who looked like she could tear through the football team without breaking a sweat. "Here's what's going to happen," Victoria announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Marcus, Jake, and Tyler, you're going to stay after class. We're going to discuss respect, consequences, and why pranking someone with combat training is generally considered a poor life choice." Tyler raised his hand tentatively. "What if we don't want to stay?" Victoria smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Marcus had ever seen on a teacher's face. "Then you'll discover why Muay Thai is called the art of 8 limbs. 2 fists, 2 elbows, 2 knees, 2 shins. All of them are excellent for teaching lessons about respect." She walked over to the whiteboard and wrote today's date in neat handwriting. "For the rest of you, we're going to continue our discussion of The Great Gatsby. Specifically, we're going to analyze the scene where Tom Buchanan's sense of superiority gets him into trouble he can't handle." Victoria picked up her copy of the novel, and Marcus noticed that her hands were completely steady. No trembling, no nervous energy, just the calm confidence of someone who had faced down much worse than high school bullies. "Sometimes," she said, opening the book to the marked page, "people mistake kindness for weakness. They assume that someone who chooses patience over aggression is an easy target." Her eyes found Marcus one more time, and he felt like prey being studied by a predator. "Those people," Victoria concluded, "usually learn otherwise the hard way." The bell was still 20 minutes away, but Marcus already knew this was going to be the longest class period of his life. And somehow, he suspected his real education was just beginning. The final bell of the day rang like a death knell through Riverside High's corridors. Students poured out of classrooms with their usual end-of-day energy, but room 247 remained conspicuously quiet. Victoria Hayes sat at her desk, grading papers with mechanical precision while 3 very uncomfortable teenage boys shifted in their seats. Marcus Caldwell stared at the clock above the whiteboard, watching the minutes tick by with growing dread. The normal sounds of school, dismissal locker slams, distant laughter, car engines starting in the parking lot, felt like they were happening in another world. Here, in this classroom, time seemed suspended. Jake Morrison's leg bounced nervously under his desk, a habit that emerged whenever he was stressed. He kept glancing toward the door, calculating distances and wondering if he could make it to the hallway before Victoria could intercept him. The rational part of his brain knew he was being ridiculous. Teachers couldn't actually hurt students, no matter what they claimed about martial arts training. The less rational part of his brain remembered the way Victoria had torn herself free. From that chair like it was made of paper, Tyler Brooks sat in uncharacteristic silence, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by the kind of wariness normally reserved for approaching thunderstorms. His family's wealth had always been his shield against consequences, but something told him that Victoria Hayes wouldn't be impressed by his father's position at the bank or his mother's connections to the school board. Victoria finished marking the last essay and set down her red pen with deliberate care. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the empty classroom. She removed her glasses, cleaned the lenses methodically, and placed them back on her nose before looking up at the three. "Boys, gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the same dangerous calm it had held during class, "I believe we have some things to discuss." She stood and walked to the classroom door, closing it with a soft click that somehow sounded final. "Marcus." Notice she didn't lock it, but the gesture felt ominous nonetheless. "Let's start with honesty," Victoria continued, turning back to face them. "Marcus, you planned this prank. Jake, you provided reconnaissance and moral support. Tyler, you encouraged the whole thing and probably helped with logistics. Does that sound accurate?" The three boys exchanged glances but remained silent. Victoria nodded as if their lack of response confirmed everything she'd suspected. "In Thailand," she said, beginning to pace slowly in front of the whiteboard, "I taught students who had genuine reasons to act out. Kids whose families couldn't afford school supplies, who worked nights to help pay rent, who faced real hardships that made education feel irrelevant." She paused in front of Jake's desk. "Those students never pulled pranks designed to humiliate their teachers. You know why?" Jake shook his head mutely. "Because they understood respect comes from recognizing that everyone in the room is fighting battles you know nothing about." Victoria's voice carried a weight that made all three boys shift uncomfortably. "But you three," she continued, moving to stand in the center of the room, "you live in a different world. Comfortable homes, college funds, parents who solve your problems with phone calls to the principal. You've never had to earn respect because you've never had to face real consequences." Marcus finally found his voice. "Look, Ms. Hayes, it was just a joke. We didn't mean—" "You didn't mean what?" Victoria interrupted sharply. "You didn't mean to embarrass me in front of 30 students. You didn't mean to film it for social media. You didn't mean to undermine my authority on my second day." She moved closer to Marcus and he instinctively leaned back in his chair. "Or did you not mean to get caught?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks, caught between embarrassment and a growing anger that someone was speaking to him this way. He was Marcus Caldwell, star athlete, popular kid, someone who mattered. At this school, this substitute teacher, no matter what martial arts she claimed to know, was still just a temporary employee. "You can't actually do anything to us," Marcus said, his voice carrying more bravado than he felt. "You're just a sub. You'll be gone in a week, and we'll still be here." Victoria smiled, and it was the expression of someone who had been hoping for exactly that response. "You're absolutely right, Marcus," she said pleasantly. "I am just a substitute, which means I have nothing to lose." She walked over to her desk and picked up her phone, holding it up so all three boys could see the screen clearly. "I have a video of your prank from start to finish. Your planning conversation in the hallway this morning. courtesy of the schools. Security cameras that I requested access to. And I have documentation of every disruption you've caused in this classroom. Tyler's face went pale. You can't use security footage. That's private. Actually, Victoria replied, teachers can request security footage when investigating incidents of harassment or classroom disruption. I made the request yesterday after your friend Marcus decided to challenge my qualifications. She set the phone down and leaned against her desk, crossing her arms. Here's what's interesting about being a substitute teacher with martial arts. Training, 8 years of experience dealing with difficult teenagers. I have options that your regular teachers don't. Jake swallowed hard. What kind of options? Well, Victoria said thoughtfully, I could submit all this evidence to Principal Martinez. He takes harassment of staff very seriously, especially when it's premeditated like this. That would mean suspension, probably for all 3 of you. Marcus, that would make you ineligible for Friday's football game against Central High. Marcus felt his stomach drop. The game against Central was the biggest of the season, and college scouts would be watching. A suspension would mean missing not just the game, but potentially losing scholarship opportunities. Or, Victoria continued, I could handle this the way they handle disrespect in Muay Thai training camps. She pushed off from the desk and began moving toward them with that same predatory grace they'd witnessed earlier. In Bangkok, when a student shows disrespect to their crew, their teacher, they don't get suspended or expelled. They get a lesson they never forget. Marcus shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You can't threaten students. I'll report you to. He never finished the sentence. Victoria moved faster than any of them had expected, closing the distance between them in 2 quick steps. She didn't touch Marcus, but somehow her presence, the way she carried herself, the controlled energy radiating from her compact frame, made him stumble backward until he hit the wall. Sit down, Victoria said quietly, and something in her tone made Marcus comply immediately. Now, she continued, returning to her position in front of the class, let me explain how this is going to work. You have 2 choices. She held up one finger. Option 1. I submit everything to the administration. You face the official consequences, which will include suspension and notification of your parents. Marcus loses his game, possibly his season. Tyler's parents learn about his recent academic troubles that he's been hiding. Jake gets to explain to his scholarship committee why he was suspended for harassment. The 3 boys stared at her in shock. How did she know about Tyler's grades? How did she know about Jake's scholarship applications? Victoria held up a second finger. Option 2. You learn respect the hard way, right here, right now. The classroom fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. Marcus looked at his friends, seeing his own fear reflected in their faces. What does that mean? Tyler asked in a small voice. Victoria's smile returned, sharp and predatory. It means you discover why respect matters. It means you understand that actions have consequences. And it means you learn never to underestimate someone based on appearances. She rolled up her sleeves, revealing forearms that were lean but clearly muscled, marked with small scars and calluses that spoke of years of serious training. In Muay Thai, Victoria said conversationally, we start every session with a ritual called the Ram Muay. It's a dance that shows respect to teachers, opponents, and the art itself. It reminds fighters that skill comes with responsibility. She moved into a stance that was both graceful and threatening, her weight balanced perfectly on the balls of her feet. Today, gentlemen, you're going to learn about respect. And I guarantee you'll never forget the lesson. The classroom felt smaller suddenly, the walls seeming to close in around 3 teenagers who were beginning to understand. They had made a very serious mistake. The overhead fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across room 247 as Victoria Hayes moved into what any trained fighter would recognize as a combat stance. Her feet were positioned precisely, weight distributed for maximum mobility and power generation. To the three teenage boys watching her, she no longer looked anything like a substitute English teacher. Marcus Caldwell felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the classroom's air conditioning. He'd been in plenty of fights, mostly shoving, matches in locker rooms, or drunken altercations at parties, but nothing had prepared him for the predatory stillness radiating from the woman in front of him. "Stand up," Victoria commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The three boys remained frozen in their seats, each hoping someone else would move first. Victoria's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "I said stand up." This time her tone carried an edge that made Jake Morrison's hands shake as he gripped his desk. Slowly, reluctantly, the three teenagers rose from their chairs. Marcus tried to maintain some semblance of his usual confidence, squaring his shoulders and attempting to use his height advantage. At 6 feet tall, he towered over Victoria's compact frame, but somehow that didn't make him feel any safer. "Excellent," Victoria said with mock approval. "Now, let's discuss the concept of respect through practical demonstration." She began to circle them slowly, like a shark sizing up potential prey. In authentic Muay Thai training, students learn humility before they learn technique. They understand that strength without wisdom is just violence, and violence without purpose is just chaos. Tyler Brooks shifted nervously, his designer sneakers squeaking against the linoleum floor. "Look, Ms. Hayes, we get it, okay? We're sorry about the prank. It won't happen again." Victoria paused her circling, tilting her head as if considering his words. "Sorry," she repeated thoughtfully. "An interesting word. In Thai, there are different types of apologies. Core thought for minor inconveniences, Sial Jai for genuine regret, and Sial Nam Jai for apologies that come from true understanding of harm caused." She moved closer to Tyler, who instinctively stepped backward until he bumped into a desk. "Which type of sorry are you offering, Tyler? The kind that means you regret getting caught, or the kind that means you understand why your actions were wrong?" Tyler's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, caught between his instinct to maintain face and his growing fear of this woman, who seemed to have transformed into something dangerous. "Let me help you understand the difference," Victoria said pleasantly. Without warning, she moved. Her hand shot out in a lightning-fast motion that stopped just inches from Tyler's throat, close enough that he could feel the displaced air against his skin. The movement was so precise, so controlled, that it was clear she could have made contact if she'd chosen to. Tyler stumbled backward, nearly falling over the desk behind him. His face had gone pale, and his breathing came in short, panicked gasps. "That," Victoria explained calmly, returning to her relaxed stance, "was a technique called sulk tea, an upward elbow strike that, if delivered with full force, could collapse your windpipe." She demonstrated the motion again in slow motion, her elbow cutting through the air with mechanical precision. In competition, it's used to end fights quickly. In training, it teaches students to respect the power they're learning to wield. "Jake." Morrison had pressed himself against the wall, trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and Victoria. "You're crazy," he whispered, his voice cracking with fear. Victoria's attention shifted to him, and Jake immediately regretted speaking. "Crazy," she mused, moving toward him with that same fluid grace. Another interesting word choice. In Muay Thai philosophy, there's a concept called Jai Yen, cool heart. It means maintaining emotional control, even in the most intense situations. She stopped directly in front of Jake, close enough that he could see the small scars on her knuckles, and the calluses that spoke of years of striking heavy bags and wooden posts. "What you're witnessing isn't craziness, Jake. It's perfect control. I could have seriously injured Tyler just now, but I chose not to. I could hurt you right now, but I'm choosing not to." Do you understand the difference? Jake nodded frantically, not trusting his voice. Good, Victoria said with satisfaction. You're beginning to understand the lesson. She turned her attention to Marcus, who had been standing frozen throughout the exchange. Despite his athletic training and natural size advantage, he looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Marcus, Victoria said, approaching him with deliberate slowness, you seem to be the leader of this little group. The one who planned the prank, who decided that humiliating a teacher would be entertaining. Marcus tried to summon his usual bravado, but found it had deserted him entirely. We didn't think ... Exactly, Victoria interrupted. You didn't think so. You acted on impulse, assuming there would be no real consequences for your behavior. She stopped just outside arm's reach, studying him with the intensity of a scientist, examining a specimen. Tell me, Marcus, what do you think would happen if you tried to hit me right now? The question hung in the air like a trap. Marcus looked around desperately, hoping for some escape from this nightmare scenario, but his friends were just as terrified as he was. I wouldn't, Marcus stammered. I don't hit girls, Victoria laughed, a sound that held no humor whatsoever. How gallant. But I'm not asking about your moral code. I'm asking about your assessment of the tactical situation. If you threw a punch right now, what do you think the outcome would be? Marcus remained silent, sensing that any answer he gave would be wrong. Let me show you, Victoria said. She moved into a fighting stance, her hands coming up in a loose guard position. This is how I stood when I sparred with professional fighters in Bangkok. Men who were faster, stronger, and heavier than you. Men who had been training since childhood. Fighting for money. Her stance was perfect, balanced, mobile, ready to explode into action from any angle. Even to Marcus's untrained eye, it was obvious he was looking at someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The thing about Muay Thai, Victoria continued, beginning to shadow box with fluid, controlled movements, is that it teaches you to use every part of your body as a weapon. Fists, elbows, knees, shins. 8 points of contact, each one capable of ending a fight. She demonstrated a knee strike, bringing her leg up with snapping precision that would have driven through someone's rib cage. The speed and power of the movement made all three boys take involuntary steps backward. But the most important lesson, Victoria said, returning to her relaxed stance, isn't about fighting. It's about respect. Respect for your opponents, respect for your teachers, and respect for the consequences of your actions. She looked at each of them in turn, letting the weight of her words sink in. You came into my classroom thinking you could embarrass me because I'm a substitute teacher. A temporary authority figure you didn't have to take seriously. Victoria moved back to her desk, but her posture remained alert, ready. What you failed to understand is that respect isn't given based on job titles or permanent positions. It's earned through actions and given through choice. She picked up her phone from the desk, holding it up so they could see the screen. I have enough evidence to end your high school careers. Marcus loses his football season and his college prospects. Tyler's parents discover he's been hiding his failing grades. Jake's scholarship applications get flagged for disciplinary issues. The three boys stared at the device like it was a loaded weapon pointed at their futures. Or, Victoria continued, setting the phone down, you can learn the lesson I'm trying to teach you right now. That actions have consequences, that respect matters, and that you never really know who you're dealing with until it's too late. She moved closer to them one final time, and they could see that despite everything that had happened, she was completely calm. No elevated breathing, no tension in her movements, just the controlled presence of someone in complete command of the situation. So, gentlemen, Victoria said quietly, what have you learned today? The silence in room 247 stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the nervous breathing of three thoroughly chastened teenagers. Victoria Hayes stood before them, No longer the mild-mannered substitute teacher they'd targeted that morning, but someone who had fundamentally altered their understanding of power, respect, and consequences. Marcus Caldwell was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. We learned ... We learned not to mess with you. Victoria shook her head slowly, her expression suggesting that answer was insufficient. Try again, Marcus. Think deeper. Jake Morrison swallowed hard before attempting his own response. We learned that ... people aren't always what they seem. Closer, Victoria acknowledged, but still surface level. Tyler? Tyler Brooks, who had been unusually quiet since Victoria's demonstration near his throat, seemed to be struggling with something internal. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. We learned that respect isn't about being afraid of someone, he said slowly, working through the thought. It's about recognizing that everyone has value, and everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of whether they can hurt you or not. Victoria's expression shifted slightly, the predatory edge softening into something that might have been approval. Better, much better. Continue that thought. Tyler looked at his friends, then back at Victoria. We pranked you because we thought you were just a substitute. Someone temporary who didn't matter. But that says more about us than it does about you. Go on, Victoria encouraged. You could have hurt us, Tyler continued, his confidence growing. You proved that you have skills we didn't know about. But the real lesson isn't that we should be afraid of you. It's that we should have respected you from the beginning, not because of what you could do to us, but because it was the right thing to do. Victoria nodded, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she seemed genuinely pleased. Now we're getting somewhere. What else? Jake found his voice again, steadier this time. I think we learned that our actions affect real people. When we planned this prank, we were thinking about how funny it would be, how cool we'd look. We weren't thinking about how it would make you feel. And? Victoria prompted. And that's selfish, Jake admitted. Really selfish. You're trying to do your job, trying to teach us, and we made that harder for no good reason except our own entertainment. Marcus had been listening to his friends with growing discomfort, not because he disagreed with them, but because their words were forcing him to confront truths about himself he'd been avoiding. When Victoria's attention returned to him, he felt exposed, in a way that had nothing to do with her martial arts skills. Marcus, she said, what's your understanding of today's lesson? Marcus struggled for a moment, his usual easy confidence replaced by something raw and more honest. I learned that I'm kind of a terrible person, he said finally. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Explain. I mean, look at what we did, Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength as he worked through his thoughts. We targeted you specifically because you were new, because we thought you couldn't fight back. That's not just disrespectful. Cowardly. He looked at Jake and Tyler, seeing his own shame reflected in their faces, and it's not the first time. We do this stuff because we can get away with it. Because we're popular. Because our parents have money or influence. Because we play sports. We've been using our advantages to make other people's lives harder. Victoria listened without interruption, letting Marcus continue his self-reflection. The thing is, Marcus said, I don't even know why we do it. It's not like pranking teachers makes us happier. It's not like being mean to people actually improves our lives. We just do it because ... because we can. And how does that make you feel? Victoria asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Ashamed. He admitted, really ashamed. Not just about today, but about a lot of things. Victoria walked back to her desk and picked up the chair that still bore patches of fabric from her blazer. She examined it thoughtfully before setting it aside and retrieving a different chair from the corner of the room. Shame can be a powerful teacher, she said, settling into the new chair with casual grace, but only if it leads to change. Otherwise, it's just another form of self-indulgence. She looked at each of them in turn. So the question becomes, what are you going to do with this understanding? The three boys exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for this shift from punishment to planning. We could apologize, Jake offered tentatively. You could, Victoria agreed. But apologies without changed behavior are just words. What else? Tyler spoke up. We could stop pranking teachers. Stop. Stop being jerks to people who can't fight. Back, also a good start, Victoria said. But I'm thinking of the bigger picture. You three have influence at this school. You have social capital. How could you use that in a positive way? Marcus frowned, wrestling with the concept. You mean like standing up for people instead of picking on them? That's one possibility, Victoria said. What others can you think of? The conversation that followed was unlike anything the three boys had experienced in a classroom before. Victoria guided them through a discussion of power, responsibility, and the ripple effects of their choices. She shared stories from her time in Thailand, not about martial arts training, but about students who had overcome genuine hardships through education and mutual support. In Bangkok, she told them, I taught a student named Siraporn whose family sold food on the street to pay for her school supplies. She never missed class, never complained about the heat or the overcrowding, never disrespected her teachers. You know why? The three boys shook their heads. Because she understood that education was a privilege, not a right. That every day in school was an opportunity someone was sacrificing to give her. Victoria stood and walked to the window, looking out at the nearly empty parking lot. You three have advantages that most of the world's students can only dream of. Safe schools, qualified teachers, college opportunities, supportive families. The question is, what are you going to do with those advantages? When she turned back to face them, the predatory intensity was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. I'm going to make you an offer, Victoria said. I'm going to delete the video evidence of today's prank. I'm not going to report this to the administration. You're going to walk out of here with clean records and second chances. The relief on their faces was immediately tempered by wariness. There had to be a catch. In exchange, Victoria continued, you're going to prove that today meant something. You're going to show me, and more importantly show yourselves, that you can be better than you were this morning. She moved to the whiteboard and wrote 3 names: Marcus, Jake, Tyler. Marcus, you're going to use your position on the football team to stop hazing of younger players. I know it happens, and I know you've participated. That ends now. Marcus nodded slowly. Okay, I can do that. Jake, you're going to start a peer tutoring program. You're good at math and science. There are students here who need help, but are too proud or too scared to ask for it officially. Jake looked surprised but not unwilling. How would I even start something like that? Talk to your guidance counselor, Victoria suggested. Propose it as a student-led initiative. Make it cool to help instead of cool to hurt. She turned to Tyler. Tyler, you're going to be my liaison. Once a week, you're going to give me a report on how the other two are doing with their commitments. And you're going to address your own academic issues honestly instead of hiding them from your parents. Tyler winced but nodded. They're going to be really angry when they find out about my grades. Probably, Victoria agreed. But they'll be angrier if they find out you've been lying about them. Trust me, facing problems honestly is always better than hiding from them. She erased the names from the board and sat back down. This isn't a punishment, she said. It's an opportunity. You get to choose who you want to be going forward. You can go back to being the kind of people who glue teachers to chairs for entertainment, or you can become the kind of people who make their school a better place. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the classroom windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, the last few cars were leaving the parking lot as custodial staff began their evening routines. "One more thing," Victoria said, as the three boys prepared to leave. "This conversation stays between us. Not because it's a secret, but because real change happens quietly. You don't get credit for doing the right thing when you're just fixing problems you created in the first place." As Marcus, Jake, and Tyler gathered their backpacks and headed for the door, each of them paused to look back at Victoria one more time. She had returned to grading papers, looking once again like nothing more than a substitute teacher catching up on work. But they would never see her that way again. More importantly, they would never see themselves the same way either. Hallway was empty and echoing as they walked toward the main exit, each lost in his own thoughts about the day's events and what came next. Behind them, in room 247, Victoria Hayes continued her grading, occasionally glancing up at the chair in the corner, a small reminder that sometimes the best lessons are the ones that teach students to question everything they thought they knew, especially about themselves. The November rain drummed against the windows of Riverside High as Victoria Hayes finished setting up her permanent classroom. After Mrs. Patterson decided to take early retirement, the school board had offered Victoria the position full-time. The irony wasn't lost on her that a job she'd taken as a temporary measure had become exactly what she needed. Room 247 looked different now. Student artwork covered one wall, not the mandatory assignments that usually decorated classrooms, but genuine creative work that students had volunteered to display. A small shelf near the window held books in Thai, gifts from Victoria's former colleagues in Bangkok who had visited over the summer. Most significantly, there was no longer any industrial adhesive residue on any of the furniture. Victoria checked her watch as students began filtering in for the 5th period, the same class that had witnessed Marcus Caldwell's ill-fated prank now bore little resemblance to the group that had watched their teacher tear herself free from a glued chair 3 months ago. Marcus entered first, as had become his habit. The transformation in him was immediately visible to anyone who had known him before. His swagger had been replaced by something more substantial, confidence that came from respect rather than fear. He'd grown his hair out slightly, abandoning the expensive styling products in favor of a more natural look that made him appear less artificial. "Afternoon, Miss Hayes," he said, settling into his usual seat in the back corner. The location was the same, but the energy was completely different. Instead of positioning himself for maximum disruption, Marcus now sat there because he'd become the unofficial guardian of class dynamics, quick to shut down any student who tried to derail discussions. Jake Morrison followed, carrying a stack of papers that Victoria recognized as math tutoring worksheets. His peer tutoring program had grown from a tentative experiment to one of the most successful student initiatives in the school's history. What had started as academic assistance had evolved into something closer to mentorship, with Jake helping younger students navigate not just equations, but the social complexities of high school. "How did the session with the freshmen go yesterday?" Victoria asked as Jake took his seat. "Really well," Jake replied, his face lighting up with genuine enthusiasm. "Sarah Martinez finally understood quadratic equations, and Tom Rodriguez is actually ahead of his class now. I think he was just too embarrassed to ask for help in front of his friends." Tyler Brooks arrived last as always, but his tardiness now came from legitimate responsibilities rather than calculated disrespect. As student liaison, he'd taken his reporting duties seriously, which had led to him becoming involved in other school improvement initiatives. Today, he carried a tablet and a folder thick with progress reports. "Everyone's here," Tyler announced unnecessarily, taking his seat and opening his folder. His grades had improved dramatically once he'd stopped hiding his struggles from his parents. The conversation with them had been as difficult as Victoria had predicted, but the support that followed had surprised him. Victoria began class the way she always did now, with a moment of genuine connection rather than jumping straight into curriculum. "Before we discuss today's reading, I want to hear about weekend highlights." Not the usual, nothing much responses. I want to hear about something that mattered to you. This ritual had emerged organically in the weeks following. The glue incident. Victoria had discovered that giving students a chance to share something meaningful created a foundation of mutual respect that made everything else easier. A girl named Emma raised her hand. I got accepted to the summer writing program at the State University, the one Ms. Hayes told us about. Spontaneous applause erupted from several students, led by Marcus. 3 months ago, he would have rolled his eyes at academic achievements. Now he was often the first to celebrate his classmates' successes. That's fantastic, Emma, Victoria said with genuine pride. Your essay about your grandmother's immigration story was exactly the kind of personal narrative they're looking for. More hands went up around the room. Students shared college acceptance letters, successful performances in school plays, volunteer work at local animal shelters. The atmosphere was one of support and celebration rather than competition and judgment. When the sharing concluded, Victoria moved to the day's lesson. Today we're finishing our unit on social justice literature by discussing how the themes we've explored connect to current events and personal experiences. She'd redesigned the curriculum significantly since becoming the permanent teacher. While still covering required texts, she'd added contemporary works that spoke to her students' lived experiences and challenged them to think critically about their roles in their communities. Marcus, you mentioned last week that reading about institutional power dynamics made you think differently about team hierarchies. Can you expand on that? Marcus nodded thoughtfully. When we read about how systems can perpetuate unfairness, even when individuals aren't trying to be unfair, it made me realize how football hazing worked the same way. Like nobody thought they were being cruel, it was just tradition. But tradition can be wrong. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Since we stopped the hazing rituals, team morale is actually better. Guys aren't afraid of upperclassmen anymore, which means they play with more confidence. We're having our best season in years. Jake added, it's the same with tutoring. A lot of kids struggle academically not because they're not smart, but because the system makes them feel like asking for help is admitting weakness. Once we created a space where getting help was normal, everything changed. Victoria watched the discussion unfold with satisfaction. This was what education was supposed to look like: students making connections between literature and life, supporting each other's growth, taking ownership of their learning. Tyler consulted his tablet and raised his hand. Speaking of systemic change, I have updates on our 3-month commitments. Victoria had almost forgotten about the formal reporting structure they'd established. Tyler's weekly reports had evolved into comprehensive assessments of school climate. Improvements. Marcus has eliminated hazing incidents on the football team entirely, Tyler reported. Coach Williams says team chemistry is the best he's seen in 15 years. 3 freshman players specifically mentioned feeling welcomed instead of targeted. Marcus tried to look modest but couldn't hide his pride in the accomplishment. Jake's tutoring program now serves 43 students across all grade levels, Tyler continued. Average math scores have improved by 18% among program participants, and the guidance office reports a 30% reduction in academic stress-related counseling requests. Jake grinned, clearly pleased with the quantifiable impact of his work. And my own progress, Tyler said, reading from his tablet, includes maintaining a B+ average for the first time since middle school, completing 20 hours of community service at the Literacy Center, and establishing honest communication with my parents about academic challenges. Victoria felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the classroom's heating system. These 3 young men had not only fulfilled their commitments, but had exceeded them in ways that surprised even her. There's something else, Tyler added, looking slightly nervous. The 3 of us have been talking, and we want to propose something. He glanced at Marcus and Jake, who nodded encouragingly. We want to start a program for incoming freshmen, Tyler explained. Like an orientation that's actually helpful instead of just administrative stuff. We'd pair upperclassmen mentors with new students to help them navigate social dynamics, academic expectations, and school resources. Marcus leaned forward in his seat. We figure that if we can prevent people from making the same mistakes we made, everybody benefits. Freshmen feel more supported. Upperclassmen learn leadership skills, and teachers don't have to deal with as much acting out. Jake pulled out a detailed proposal from his backpack. We've already talked to Principal Martinez and several teachers. They're interested, but they want faculty supervision. We were hoping you'd consider being our advisor. Victoria accepted the document, scanning the carefully thought-out plan. The proposal included mentor training protocols, regular check-in, procedures, and assessment metrics to measure program effectiveness. It was thoroughly researched and professionally presented. This is impressive work, Victoria said, genuinely amazed by the depth of their planning. When did you find time to put this together? We've been meeting every Friday after school for the past month, Marcus explained. Tyler's organizational skills, Jake's research abilities, and my connections with student athletes made it easier than we expected. Victoria set the proposal on her desk, making a mental note to review it thoroughly that evening. I'm honored that you'd want me to advise you on this program. Let me read through everything and we'll discuss implementation details next week. As the bell rang and students began gathering their belongings, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 months ago, she'd been a substitute teacher dealing with pranksters who saw her as an easy target. Now, she was watching those same students propose initiatives that could positively impact hundreds of their peers. Marcus lingered as other students filed out. Ms. Hayes, I wanted to ask you something. Victoria nodded, organizing her materials for the next class. That day with the glue, Marcus said quietly, you could have destroyed us. You had everything you needed to get us suspended, maybe even expelled. Why didn't you? Victoria considered the question, remembering her own anger and the satisfaction she'd felt demonstrating her martial arts skills. Because punishment without learning is just revenge, she said finally. And revenge doesn't create positive change. She picked up the mentorship proposal from her desk. Besides, look at what you've accomplished when someone believes you could. Be better instead of just assuming you'd stay the same. Marcus smiled, an expression of genuine gratitude rather than his old calculated charm. Thank you for seeing something in us that we didn't see in ourselves. As he headed for the door, Victoria called after him. Marcus, one more thing. He turned back expectantly. That Muay Thai training I mentioned? I still practice every evening at the community center. If you're ever interested in learning real discipline and respect, you're welcome to join. Marcus's eyes lit up with interest. Really? You'd teach us? I'd consider it, Victoria replied with a slight smile. After all, the best way to understand power is to learn how to use it responsibly. As the door closed behind Marcus, Victoria gathered her things and prepared for her final class of the day. Outside, the November rain continued to fall, but inside room 247, something had fundamentally shifted. What had begun as a confrontation over a childish prank had evolved into a transformation that extended far beyond the original participants. Victoria Hayes had come to Riverside High as a temporary substitute teacher looking for a fresh start. She'd found something better, the opportunity to help young people discover their capacity for growth, leadership, and positive change. And in teaching them those lessons, she'd rediscovered why she'd chosen education in the first place. Sometimes, the best victories are the ones where everyone wins. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.